Good afternoon, everybody.
Monica.
Welcome. We are going to go on the record now. This is a work session. Today is December 15, 2023, work session on AR 2023-421, a resolution of the Anchorage Assembly appropriating $1,500,000 from the Alcohol Beverage Retail Sales Tax Fund 206 fund balance to the to the Real Estate Department 2024 operating budget and $500,000 from the Alcohol Beverage Retail Sales Tax Fund 206 to the Anchorage Health Department 2024 operating budget, all within the Alcohol Beverage Retail Sales Tax Fund 206, and authorizing grant agreements with the Anchorage Coalition and Homelessness for the Anchored Home Next Up pilot program and to restorative and reentry services for the cost of the pallet shelter pilot program. So Ms. Salatil is excused as a conflict. Coalition is her employer. And so we will do introductions now. Mr. Volland.
Daniel Volland.
Kevin Cross.
Karen Bronga.
Christopher Constant.
Felix Rivera.
And on the phone we have Mr. Martinez.
Yes, sir. George
Thank
Martinez.
you. Mr. Myers.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And Mr. Salt.
Randy Schultz here. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there anyone else on the phone? Do we have a representative from, we do. Jessica's here. Okay, from the coalition. So I think that since the primary sponsors are members Rivera, Volland, and Bronga, I will turn to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
Great, thank you. So for this item, I'm just going to give a brief introduction, and then I am going to turn it over to the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness to talk about the Next Step pilot program. And then folks can answer any questions that they may have of them. And then I'll turn it over to RRS to talk about the pallet shelter pilot program. And folks may ask any questions of them. So in general, just to give a brief introduction, a lot of this work that we are doing is really about doing what we can to have a successful transition out of emergency cold weather shelter and focusing as much as we can on the permanent solution out of emergency cold weather shelter, which is housing. So you will see that a majority of these funds, approximately about 75% of these funds, are going towards that permanent solution, and about 25% of these funds are going towards more of a temporary solution with the transitional housing project envisioned for the pallet shelters, which, to be perfectly blunt, pallet shelters are considered by HUD to be another form of shelter. But I think it's appropriate for us to be making these kinds of investments across the system, just as long as we can agree from a policy level that these investments are meeting our end goal as a system, which is to make sure that folks are moving into permanent housing of some sort with supports. So that's why we have brought these together. Just to do a little bit of math right now, if we're just focusing on the population of folks who are in emergency cold weather shelter, there's about 574 beds in emergency cold weather shelter. And most of the time, most of those beds are full. So let's just assume we have that population. Right now, the only real investment that we have made with regard to the transition out of emergency cold weather shelter was the $1.3 million to the Anchorage Affordable Housing and Land Trust, which is about 40 units of vacant and abandoned properties, and rehabbing those properties to turn them back on into housing. So that's 40. At the Housing and Homelessness Committee, we did talk about, earlier this week, we did talk about the cold weather shelter and possible continual usage of the cold weather shelter in a couple different forms, and I won't go into those details. But let's just assume that's another 150 beds. So that still leaves us a delta of 384 individuals currently residing in emergency cold weather shelter that will be on our streets if we don't have an alternative plan. So what this $2 million appropriation does is provides another 190 beds. So approximately 150 through Next Step, which is housing 150 folks through April, and then about 40 individuals through the pallet shelter pilot program. So that still leaves us, just to, again, be perfectly honest here, it still leaves us a delta of 194 individuals residing in emergency cold weather shelter that will need to find some alternatives by April. But I think the more that we can take bites out of this apple, the better. And I think this appropriation helps us to do that in a significant way, so that come next summer, we don't have the kind of chaos that we've seen the last couple of summers. I don't know if my co-sponsors want to add anything else, but that's it for me.
Okay. No one else. All right, Jessica, welcome.
All right, thank you. As there was a work session when the Houston team was up here, I'm going to just expand on the work that we've done since then in outlining some of these goals and objectives around this plan, and then, of course, answer any questions that anyone might have. So over the past week since the Houston team left, we have entered into conversations with Henning, who is the operator of the emergency cold weather shelter facilities here in Anchorage. We are working right now on a MOU that would outline roles and responsibilities of this project going forward in terms of the housing navigation work, doing the housing needs assessment, and identifying individuals that would move through this project. We've been working with a real estate agent, with housing experts to identify units. As of right now, we've identified approximately 50 units that would be available to us through this pilot, so that we could start moving people into those units, and opened conversations with 4 case management providers so that we can get those contracts in place and have case management services available to people as they move in. On the ACH website, we created a landing page for this project that has a ticker that will count as people are housed under this project, and the expenditures that are affiliated with those people moving in, and then all of the information for landlords, for providers, and for the public that are interested in knowing more about the project.
Ms. Bronga?
Thank you. I was going to ask you, when I went to the open house at ACEH, I'm pretty sure I heard the figure 35,000 a year. And then on here, I believe somewhere else it's like 30,000 something. And then I've also heard the figure $75 a day versus when they're in the shelter, it's nearly $100 a day. So I'm wondering if you're landing on a firmer number at this point.
Yeah, it's just under $31,000 annually, and that's all inclusive. Breaking it down, there are some expenses that are like broken down between the rental assistance, the case management, and then some like project management expenses. So that's where I think some of the different numbers came in, but it's just under 31,000 annually per person. And that breaks down to just under $85 per day.
I had a few more questions. It's all right. And first off, I really love the idea of housing, but I asked you this before, and I was still kind of digging around on the internet trying to figure out the reason. Like it seems to me it's that 2-bedroom apartments are much cheaper than 1-bedroom. And I couldn't find, you said HUD will only pay for single occupancy. And so I don't understand that, but if you could explain that. a little bit?
If a person has a housing voucher, for example, there's payment standards that are tied to those individual housing vouchers. So if somebody wanted a 2-bedroom unit with a roommate, for example, it all has to go through that approval process through the voucher. It's not unheard of for someone to be able to have a roommate with a voucher paying for that half of their expenses. It is more difficult to find a landlord that is interested in 2 separate leases for a 2-bedroom apartment because those would have to be a lease in each person's name in order to apply the voucher for the payment for just the half that would apply to the one person. So that is a little bit more difficult to find a landlord that's interested in renting out a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 separate leases with 2 separate individuals.
Keep rolling. Then my next question is the Houston model really strongly showed that their clients contributed to the housing in some way, whether it was a very small amount. And I haven't seen anything in the paperwork that says you'd be asking for a partial contribution, which I feel is really important. Even if you banked their partial contribution to help launch them into the next level of housing, I think it's important. And I wondered if you are planning on doing that or not.
Yeah, thank you. If someone has a housing voucher or if this pilot project is paying their rent and they have a source of income, they're required to put in 30% of the 30% of their income towards that rent expense. So vouchers are set up that way where there's a tenant contribution and a voucher contribution. The $31,000 is intended to be an all-in expense if that person had no resources at all from the start. We know that some people have case management services already. Some people have income. Some people might have an outside voucher that is paying for some of those expenses. So the cost to the pilot would go down if an individual did have individual resources as well.
And my last one is in this plan here, would they be using food vouchers? I mean, like if they have SNAP benefits and then you have a price for food on the chart that I saw, it seems if they are getting SNAP benefits or if they have food benefits, that would go down. And then if they have the housing voucher and the food voucher, it's going to cost less. Will that money be banked to go to a future year's project?
Yes. So if someone did have food stamp assistance or income that they were using to support food, one of the things that we've done as we've housed people in the past is ensure that in their move-in kit, they get some of those food essentials because they may not have anything at that point, especially if someone had been coming from a shelter that might be providing those food services and they didn't have the ability to store food at the shelter. So we make sure they get some of those staples, usually some shelf-stable foods. I'm trying to think, a box of cereal, some shelf-stable milk, some things like that, just to get you started for a few days of food. And then that case management services, they're going to be focused on helping that person retain that housing. And one of those things that's really important is food security. So if they didn't already have those food stamp benefits, they'd be working with them to get to a food bank and pick up food or get those applications in or get them expedited if they've been waiting on a response from the state.
So a quick follow on to that. You have an individual, you have budgeted for $31,000, but they have some pays and they have resources. So you spend $20,000. You're not giving them $10,000. You're holding that for additional people who might receive services, right?
Yes, that's correct. If there are individual resources that come in, this money would just go further and house more people.
Right. So I just want to be real clear about that. Thanks, Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a few questions from me. First is I appreciate the landing page that you all have stood up on the coalition's website. It's a little bit difficult to get there, just constructive criticism there. But for folks who maybe want to get there directly, it's just aceh.org/next-step. So it looks like you've already been making progress with the resources that you have, which is great. About 17 individuals housed out of that 150 total population. So how regular are you going to be updating this tracker here?
Every week.
Okay, great. And then how regularly are you going to be checking on housing stability?
Once people are housed, those case managers will have weekly check-ins with ACH staff through weekly case conferencing. And then we will have built into those case management contracts requirements for quarterly reports. So they'll be submitting quarterly reports back showing the stability and outcomes of the case management.
Does the project have a goal for housing stability?
Yes, our goal is 80% of the people will retain their housing through that 12-month period.
Okay. And then can you talk a little bit about the population that you're hoping to serve?
Yes. So this initial pilot is focused on people who are staying in emergency cold weather shelter currently. The site that people are being housed out of would be the Alex Hotel. So the population would be the people staying at the Alex.
Got it. Can you talk a little bit about the population staying at the Alex? And what I'm trying to get here is just, are we talking about folks who have a lot of needs, or are we talking about folks who maybe a lot of them already have a job? And like, can you describe that population, please?
Yes. So we're compiling that by name list right now from the census. One thing I can tell you is that there are not anyone. There's no one staying at that particular site that has a emotional support animal or service animal. So there's that in there. There are a few people who have outside resources. I know of at least one with employment. We haven't finished the analysis and needs assessment of each individual person yet, but there are people there with some resources.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and if I remember correctly from the Housing and Homelessness Committee meeting on Wednesday, there was some review of all three ECWS locations. And if I remember correctly, Alex was the one that really didn't have too many issues. It was the CWS and the Aviator that had issues. So I think that might be a little bit telling of that population there. And then can you talk to me a little bit about services? This is the one thing that in particular, some of my constituents are a bit skeptical on. So we know that the Houston model really talks about housing, supports, and subsidies. And so that supports piece, people want to know where's that supports coming from. And particularly when we're talking about behavioral health issues, so either mental health, substance misuse, co-occurring disorders, the other issues of, kind of connecting folks to SSI or food stamps. I think the system can handle all of that. But can the system really handle any of the other supports? Folks are skeptical about that.
The primary case management supports that will be provided through this pilot are really housing retention case management supports. So helping someone through the challenges they might be existing or they might be having that are jeopardizing their housing. So one important aspect is that those case management visits happen on site, so in the unit with the person, so they're able to get eyes on that unit and take a look and see, is this person having challenges, for example, with their laundry? So that would tell that case manager that they need to work with that person on getting quarters or getting a ride to the laundromat if it's a unit that doesn't have laundry on site. So really addressing those challenges that exist before they get to an eviction point. A lot of the referrals that you're talking about would happen at that point too. So having that conversation with the tenant about self-sufficiency and where they're feeling at in their housing at that point and what challenges they're facing. That person would also serve as the landlord point of contact. So if that landlord is having issues, they have someone that they can reach out to as well and escalate anything such as cleanliness or noise complaints that might be happening.
If you don't mind, I just want to be a little bit more pointed with my question. So is it your belief that for this 150 pilot program, that the system, and in particular the behavioral health system, has the necessary bandwidth to handle whatever supports that this 150 individuals may need? Because that's the real question folks have.
Yes, I think short answer, yes. I think that that is something that the case management staff are skilled at making those referrals and making those connections. I know that one of the biggest challenges is actually getting to appointments, remembering about your appointments. So once you have that referral, maintaining that relationship is really important. So yes, I think so.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thanks. So I have myself in the queue briefly. The HMIS, what happens with these individuals in relationship to HMIS once they become housed in this program?
Yes, so all of the case management organizations that we would contract with would have a project in HMIS that would be called a supportive services only project. And that would be a project that would track the progress made with that client and that client's exit if they had an exit. So we would be able to see in HMIS that client, notes that go along with that client's case management. And then if they were to exit, where that exit destination was, so that we don't lose them and can pick them back up with a different appropriate service. So all of the projects would be in HMIS and we would be able to track that client. We wouldn't lose them once they were housed.
And so what happens to them in the context of how we count individuals experiencing homelessness?
They would be housed, so they would no longer be counted in that. When you look at our webpage, you see that big 3,000 number. They would no longer be part of that number because they are housed.
And so how long do you think that goes before they kind of become a non-person in context of the HMIS and services and all of those things? At what point, how does that work?
So they would drop out completely out of the system if they no longer needed or wanted those case management services and they weren't being served by a project that was in HMIS. So that would be, I guess, when they would completely drop out of HMIS, is if they were no longer receiving any services.
What a lovely conversation to be having about people
It
actually
is a lovely
exiting
conversation.
the system. And I think this might be around the first time, at least I can recall us getting to a point where we can contemplate that with the project. And so that's heartening. Mr. Cross.
Thank you. Yeah, this is really interesting. As far as, just a couple thoughts on some of the investment into pallets, and I'm glad we already spoke to this, but recognizing how difficult or how expensive poverty is, because when you don't have the ability to store personal items and you don't have a safe place for those things, if you can just imagine you didn't have anywhere to place anything, you had to carry everything on you, how difficult it would be to just exist day to day, right? And so providing those individual storage needs, which I think some of those pallet shelters do, although they are recognized
I'm
as
going to
shelter.
jump in, Kevin.
Oh, go ahead.
Just, we're talking about the
Yes.
first program first, and then we're going to pivot to the pallet. So,
And I'm going to swip to that. That's the second part of my statement.
okay, good. I just want to
Which
be sure
is-
we keep it really clear. This is not pallet.
So yeah, and as we get them into that more stable, in order to do that, you have these whereas statements, which is whereas is to shift to a personal centered planning process, and the next one it just says individual needs, which I think is critical because human beings all have different challenges, and it's on the page 1, lines 26 and 29. I'm just looking at these. Shift to personal centered planning process and focus on individual needs, which is so critical, I think, for any program to survive, because we can't just assume everybody has the same problems. Everybody comes from, and every human being on this earth has different experiences of why we got to where we are in life. And it takes other people to intervene on a compassionate level. So my question is, how do we do this? And what does that look like as far as our workforce and what you have within? Because in order to actually be effective on providing individual or personal centered planning process, it's going to take a lot of compassionate people on the ground. So what does that look like? How many people are you looking to bring in? Tell me a little about capacity.
Yep. So we're looking at a team of housing navigators that would work in that, basically with the outreach work that is happening, doing that housing navigation work for the longer term future of this project. For the short term, the Henning staff have housing navigators on staff at each shelter. That's part of the work that they're doing in being a housing focused shelter. So working out of the Alex, it's working really closely with the Henning staff on doing some of that navigation, creating those plans, working with the ACH staff on what those plans look like for that person's housing needs. Just as you said, some people have different resources and different needs than other people. So it's really important that we take a look at what each individual needs. And then once they're into housing, having that really warm handoff to the case manager, who then helps like take that the next step and doesn't lose all of that work that was done while they were in shelter, while they were navigating into the housing, and then once they move in.
Do you see a lot of turnover in those positions, or is it pretty consistent? Because I imagine getting someone trained and finding the right people who are compassionate and connect with people on a personal level can be difficult. So
Yep. Our plan is to work with existing case management providers and buy some of their time, recognizing that there is turnover and there is limited staff capacity. So if there might not be capacity for someone to take on an entire case manager and an entire caseload, but they have a case manager that might be able to pick up 3 clients, we're looking to buy pieces of case management. And then some organizations might have the capacity to take on even more people. In response to the second part of the question, I think there is a lot of turnover in this field. It is a really difficult field to be in, but I think that you can't beat the heart and the compassion that exists within the Anchorage community and the case management staff. My experience has been that when there is turnover, those handoffs between case managers aren't as rocky as you would think they would be.
yeah, I would just imagine that if every day your job was to help people that are probably in the worst position they've been in life, it can be very humbling and exasperating emotionally. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Brown?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just really quick before we transition. So I guess just echoing one of the questions I had and then what Mr. Cross was saying. There are a lot of, I think, somewhat valid concerns in the community, particularly around the supports and services part of this work. I think folks are a little bit less concerned about the housing and more concerned about the support and services. And I appreciate that you feel very confident that you're going to be able to handle the support and services and the workforce churn there. I'm wondering, though, if the pilot program feels like it's getting to a point where you think you're reaching the capacity there to provide the support and services, I think it would be great for you to notify the municipality and make a stink of it, because I think that's important, because we are going to Juneau and advocating that the state invests heavily in behavioral health. That's one of our top priorities. And I think this will give us a clear indication of whether our behavioral health system is tapped out or not. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I didn't hear that you're planning to deliver behavioral health care services. And so I want to be really clear that that isn't part of this proposal. It's linking people to providers in the community, funding sources to engage these people with the experts. But I don't believe the coalition is intending to join as
That's
a
true.
provider. So a broker, maybe. Ms. Bronco.
So do you think there'll be sort of a homogenized lease that you're working with the landlords and I'm just envisioning a couple things, which happen in anyone as a landlord's rentals, but may happen with this a little more often, is bringing lots of friends in, whether just compassionate for someone who's stuck out and doesn't have a place. How are you going to keep it to whoever's on the lease? And then I know that there's been a problem in some of even at the Alex, with people going away for a while and so then this bed is being paid for and they're not in there. So I would imagine there's an expectation that they actually are residing there, not going to, off to the village during fish season or something and then coming back. I don't know. And then is it a 1,600 that the landlords are getting as a kind of an incentive, or what's the incentive for them to hold their unit for this?
Yep, thank you. I'll hopefully take them in order. So regarding your first one about leases, we do have some template leases that are developed if we do encounter a landlord who doesn't really have a formal lease in place that they can use. It's kind of fill in the blanks. And there's a lot of resources out there with Alaska Legal Services to get that. If the lease has terms around unit occupancy in terms of how many days you can be vacant before it's considered abandoned, or how many guests you're allowed to have at any given time. That's something that's really important for the case management to be working with them on. And that's the importance of having that point of contact for the landlord. So if the landlord is noticing issues like that, they can bring them up. And the case manager can work to mediate those issues before they get to the point of an eviction. So I hope that answered the first one. The $1,600 was what Houston used. That was their number. What this proposal has in place is a unit hold fee. So if we identify a landlord that has a vacant unit, but they want to move on, they don't want to hold it for any reason, we can give them some funding to be able to hold that unit until we're able to get an application submitted, get someone document ready, and get the lease signed and get them moved in. And that is budgeted right now at $500.
And there's a slush fund if something happens to the apartment to fix it.
If one of the things that we'll be doing is connecting potential landlords with the United Way Landlord Housing Partnership, and they have a risk mitigation fund and some retention incentives in place if that landlord is interested in that. It's not going to be a requirement, though. Not every landlord will have to go through that program, but in order to receive those incentives, it would be through that program, and we would make referrals to them.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Mr. Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess regarding the last comments, I feel maybe a little differently. I wonder if somebody was housing insecure here in Anchorage, but they had the opportunity to do their native way of life and subsistence hunting or fishing. I'd like them to have that opportunity. I think that's kind of an Alaskan value. And so if there were an opportunity for someone to do that, could they remain housed here in Anchorage through this program?
Yes, as long as it was compliant with the lease. So my experience with rental properties and leases is there's typically a 7-day period in there that if the unit is vacant with no notice for 7 days, it's considered abandoned, and they will move forward with that. But as long as the proper notice is given to the landlord, that's not typically an issue. I've in previous experience with rental properties, you have people who might have long-term hospitalizations. They may, as you said, go to a job that is out of the area, which will cause them to not be at home for periods of time. And as long as you're communicating with the landlord on what that intent is, it's not usually an issue.
Great. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, that raises some conversations we previously had. Fish camp culturally is the therapeutic experience for people who are from indigenous cultures. They can reconnect with themselves, their traditions, their history. And that therapeutic environment is where people actually make progress. And so that raises the concern of another therapeutic environment and a conversation we've heard about a bit, not for some time. An individual goes into residential treatment and they're going to be gone for 6 months. And so we have a housing unit that's sitting empty because they're over there. We don't want to destabilize them as they're going through their residential treatment, but we have a resource that's being in essence wasted where another individual could in fact be getting stabilized. And so I think I don't need an answer about how you would deal with that, but it's certainly worthy of considering mechanisms for addressing those kind of quasi long-term changes that we want to maintain stability for an individual, but we also want to be as efficient as we can with the stabilizing resources we have available. So I'm not going to ask you to dive into that fray, but be cognizant of it, because it certainly is a conversation that I've heard about. And it's just a nightmare to think we have a housing unit that could house a homeless individual, but a person is at residential treatment where they're secure for 6 months. Therefore, that place is staying empty. We need to figure that out, but that's probably next up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs development. So, and then we need to move on, Mr. Cross. Last one on this.
Yeah, just real quick. I had this conversation with the Houston group and they were up here because I was like, how do we get more property managers involved? And sorry if this is I want to get this off my mind before I forget about it. It gets filed away. But it was, what if there was a creation of a property management, like a nonprofit property management company that specialized in these services and did that, to where a property owner, rather than us buy the property, they just hand the property over. You're going to get ROI. This is your guaranteed rate, what it is, because as long as you take care of the property, I make a basics and I'm making an 8% return on whatever it is that I don't want, then fine. Then they would make sure and they would provide reports on here, the property's in good condition, it's not being abused, but then they could provide all those assurances because they manage the property. You don't have to, listen, the value in real estate, the only value of ownership is control. But if you can control it without ownership, you get all the benefits. So if we have the management company that has all these things in place and does it, and the property owner just says, here's my property, I get a reasonable return, we lease it on a 3 or 5 year contract, we wouldn't have to buy it. We could buy it on we could lease it on very attractive terms. And they would get an ROI. They wouldn't be like a triple net lease. They're just like, I'm good. With either a first right of refusal if they want to sell it, or a pre. But there's probably a lot of property managers out there and probably who are sick of dealing with tenants, but like the cash flow.
All right, so I'm going to jump in there,
anyway,
Kevin,
thank you.
and say it's a great idea for someone who has experience in mortgages, real property management, and who has a bunch of time to contemplate how that might work, to connect with an operator who is working in the nonprofit space, because I think you're absolutely onto something that could provide an amazing benefit. But I think it's a certain skill set that not everyone has. And so some folks that
I only sleep 4 hours.
some folks that we know might. And so I'm volunteering you if you find yourself with some time anytime in the near future. So with that said, we're going to pivot now to the second part of this conversation. It's probably fine to spend 3/4 of our time relative, because the money is 3/4 and 1/4. But let's pivot now to restorative reentry and the conversation about pallet shelters. Welcome. Come on up.
Thank you. We'll do this as quickly as we possibly can. Thank you. We'll do this as quickly as possible. I will say to start, I'm going to have to leave in about at 10 to 2 because we do have a town hall at Aviator that I do every Friday. And so at some point, I'm going to turn it over to Kenny Peterson to do some of the statistics and the details. As many of you know, my name is Kathleen McLaughlin, and I own Restorative and Reentry Services, LLC. For the past couple of years, I've been trying to advocate for pallet shelters, and at this point in time, I'm encouraging a discussion about why should we have pallet shelters. The first thing I want to say is they aren't a substitute to housing. They're not a substitute to housing. It's a harm reduction for our community. And just as a full disclosure, I have 2 contracts. One is a subcontract at the Anchorage Safety Center with Solid Medical. So I am doing discharge planning and community coordination for individuals that are leaving ASC, ASP. The second is they do have a contract with the municipality under the Department of Health, and that is the third-party oversight for the cold weather shelters. The way that I love to work is with a sweatshirt and to sit with all the experts in the room. And the experts aren't those that are in this room. They're the ones that are using our services on the streets. And they have informed me that we have gaps in our system that can be looked at, put a light on to try to determine how we can help that gap. And what that gap is, in my mind, are individuals who are homeless, who are not good self-advocates, who don't have a good safety net, and who are using our emergency services a lot. A lot. They're using Providence Hospital, waiting rooms, they're using the Anchorage Safety Center, and they're using a lot of the downtown area doors for a place to rest. So a pallet shelter, in my mind, is not in competition or shouldn't be considered as a housing option, but a harm reduction. A harm reduction not only for the individual to help them move from survivor mode to stabilization, but also harm reduction for the community, because these individuals don't have a place to rest. So in that light, what I see the pallet shelters doing is to be able to be that place where people can have their stuff stored, they can have a door to close, and they can have a warm place to rest. Any program would be based on trying to get people out of survival mode into stabilization. And I want to leave people with something that happened that kind of demonstrates where pallet shelters fit in. I met a guy on the street while I had my sweatshirt on, and he threw a suitcase at me. He was 56 years old, he was Alaska Native, and he was tired, and he was just tired. He also had a walker, so I knew that the suitcase probably wasn't going to hurt me, because I think I was a little bit stronger than he was. But it started a relationship on October 3rd. Since that time, he is now in permanent supportive housing. The beauty of the relationship that I built with him is that he had been on the street for a long time, and he had a voucher, but nobody could find him. So after we developed this relationship, he got sober. He stayed at the Anchorage Gospel Rescue Mission for 30 days. His voucher was invoked. He went to a temporary housing unit, and now he is permanently housed in one of our area, rural cap areas. And he still calls me. My point being, he's the individual that pallet shelters should serve. It can be a waiting area for people that are looking for and moving forward. It can be harm reduction for our community. And the beauty of a pilot, these are movable. They're movable. And to me, if something doesn't work, then we should change it up, but we shouldn't not try. So that's kind of my position on this. I would like Kenny to be able to kind of talk about the ins and outs of what we've done so far.
Thank you. It's good to be with you. It's very humbling. You folks have been working on this a long time, and so I'm grateful for what you're doing and all the questions you have. It's so much better with your questions than as a council. What I've done over time is listen to the questions you've asked, and many of them didn't have solutions, and so I've been spending some time to find solutions. The first solution would be on pallet choices, or choices of in-state, out-state. What can you choose from? I've identified in the last little while 4 different sources that you might consider. One is the pallet shelters, which we're familiar with. It's out of Washington. It's comes compressed, and it's ready to go. It's been proven in different areas, and they're about $13,000 each. Each of these solutions is about $13,000 per unit, which is about 8 by 8 or 8 by 10 cabin type location. The second solution, the Salt Lake's implementing this week, is a container called Fold'em. It's out of Japan does them. They're collapsible containers that can be uprighted, righted on both sides, and a divider in the center, a 20-foot unit. Those are about $13,000 also. And those are more stable as far as snow load or otherwise. The third option is in-state, Alaska custom containers. And they use these already in man camps. It's the same thing. You can take a 20-foot container, split it in half, and you have doors on both ends. Those are ready for it. Each of these are ready to start building them right away as you wish and desire. The fourth option for in-state is Northwood down in Kenai. He also has created a unit that you could do single, double, or triple. Each of them also come at $13,000 per unit for it. And so each of these can be built right away, and you have 4 different sources, both in-state and out-of-state, and all of these have been used and have the specs necessary for installation and otherwise for Alaska. The next one was about site locations. There's been a lot of questions about site locations. I'm grateful for the efforts that's been happening the last 2 years. There's a resolution that was done on siting for different kinds of solutions for the community. AR 2023-188-S1. And this talks about the kinds of things that you would expect in an area, what should be around it, what should be included in it. It even invites community councils, maybe even assembly members, to make recommendations so that communities aren't surprised by one of these just showing up in their area. And so that was requested, and hopefully some of those might still come in according to that resolution. Also, there's been several committees that's been in the works. I'm so grateful for that. The clean slate committees, the tent committees, and so on. All those have had discussions about them, invited community participants and community discussions. So this has been vetted quite well as far as where you might locate these in town. And then also Ms. Bronga recently has been contacted by faith leaders who would like to have these on their land already. And so there are already faith communities that would like to put some of these on their land. So we have some site options there. And then there are some additional ones that we've heard about that are viable if you choose to go forward with this. And then operations. There's always a question about operations. We've seen successes with these kind of things in the community on how to deal with difficult new projects. And so those kind of neighborhood impact agreements could be in place for such a thing as this. Also, there are established guidelines. These have been in place in many communities, and there are guidelines. One of the vendors has put together some samples that we could use if you'd like to see what an operating guideline would look like. And then finally, budgets. You have attached to your resolution here a budget. The amazing thing about it is that all of the acquisition costs, which you see on this on page 3 of 3 at the back of your project or your listing there, is that pallet shelters, the 30 of them, the transport to Seattle to Anchorage, a hygiene room, site preparation, and installation of the community. All of that is covered through through other people already willing to donate all of those capital costs for it. The next one is the operating costs. The estimated operating cost is about $500,000 per year. That's what this request is for. But even if you like the request, but you're hesitant to want to fund it, there would probably be community members who'd be in community groups that might be willing to fund it if you still want to go forth, but you're hesitant about spending the money to do so. If you like the idea, but you don't want to invest public money, you might just say you like the idea and that maybe someone can do that too for it. And I think that's just about it, Mr. Cross. I think then we can come back to it, any of them.
Mr. Cross. I'm sorry, Mr. Rivera was first.
Yeah, Rivera.
Mr. Cross.
Thank you. So a few questions. So thank you for describing the population. That's helpful. With regard to the locations, it sounds like you don't have specific locations, but I guess conceptually, is it fair to say that this is going to be a single site model or a scattered site model, or is that still up in the air?
For the pilot, I would prefer a single site model with 30 shelters, 30 pallet shelters in one location so that we can prove the concept.
Thank you. Do you have a sense of timeline?
If we could get approval of this concept, the organizations that we work with and the shipping companies have agreed that they could do it sooner rather than later. So I don't think we have to wait until spring. I think it would be probably within the next 2 months.
Thank you. And then can you just talk a little bit about how you think, and I think you mentioned this a little bit, but how you think that this fits in the system, especially as we are building a system that's really focused on housing and supports, how you think that this particular pilot project fits in that?
What I've observed and experienced is that there are a lot of people who I have met who had housing and they lost it. And so for me, instead of losing housing and going all the way to the bottom, as you can see in our letter that was attached, people should get the level of need served with the level of service that they're able to do. And for me, the pallet shelters fill a gap where people who are not ready or able to get housing at least have a place to stabilize. So I call it the elevator model, but the idea is that you would be able to use the pallets as basically a short stay type of model.
Thanks. And then the last question I have is actually for Ms. Johnson. So I know that the administration has been supportive of the Next Step pilot program, which I appreciate. If you don't have a response to this yet, that's fine. But has the administration taken a position on this shelter pilot program?
Through the chair, the administration has not taken a stance. The only flags that we have raised are the legality of operating or habitating these within Muni Code right now, because we do believe that there are needed code changes in order for people to sleep overnight in a dwelling like this.
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate that. And that's actually something that we're working with Mr. Gates on. So it's a companion piece. If the Assembly were to approve this shelter pilot program, we would need to do a subsequent title change to make this happen.
I'm going to skip you for just a minute, Mr. Cross, because we have Mr. Martinez who hasn't spoken, but Mr. Gates first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to ask, since that was mentioned just now, is the administration anyone that working on these code issues, for amendments to resolve them and enable these uses?
Through the chair to Mr. Gates, during the pilot program that we signed on to last summer, I believe we laxed some of the codes on a specific parcel of land, which I believe was the Midtown Cuddy location. But I don't know if those codes have moved forward. But there's not actively anyone within the administration that's working on code changes to allow for habitation of these pallet shelters.
If I may, the Title 21 and Title 16 provisions are expired already from that action last summer, AO 2023-70 as one that we passed. So I know we do need some additional action by ordinance for either exceptions or pilot program or permanent code change that I'm working on. But I would also mention, because I'm sorry I missed your name, Mr. Kennedy, that you mentioned several different types of shelters and not just the pallet shelter brand product. And I think it's important that you look at what we passed in Section 3 of that ordinance. It was amendments to the building code, and those were specific to exempt from a building permit and certificate of occupancy if they met these standards that are outlined there in that section. But that section was written with the great assistance from our building official, based on pallet shelters and how they're designed. So I don't know if these other products you mentioned meet those standards or not, or if we need to adjust them. So I think we should take a look at them.
So we have a number of people in the queue and only 7 minutes on the calendar. It's a work session. We don't need to extend it, but just folks, maybe we'll plan to go an extra 15 minutes and then call it. It is Friday. So in the queue first, Mr. Martinez.
Thank you, Chair. Just first, an observation. This sounds more conceptual than it sounds like a pilot program. And from my understanding, a pilot program would be very much more specific to what's described as prove the model. And I would also note that this particular model is one of many potential models to utilize a shelter similar to a pallet as described. So it's curious to me for my colleagues who are co-sponsoring, is this just appropriated funding for a housing fund to review potential housing projects, different variations of instigating housing? We focused on housing, not necessarily part of, but we didn't call it a pilot particularly. We picked a funding mechanism to pilot programs or opportunities. So it seems to me that is funding being requested for a concept at this point? Thank you.
Who wants to answer that? Mr. Volland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the way, my perspective is, first of all, I think this is consistent with the recommendation of the Behavioral Health Task Force to have not just a low barrier shelter, but potentially a no barrier shelter. And as was discussed here today, one thing that appeals to me is having this kind of be a hybrid, sort of shelter, but also transitional housing. I think that piloting this where, there are some pluses here that maybe are not in shelter, right? People have their own place to be, their own privacy, their own place to store their belongings, as Member Cross was speaking to earlier. And so while I envision this as part of the one puzzle piece of homelessness response, I think that it certainly is worth trying. I think what we've heard here today, and what I believe to be true, is that we have a trusted community partner who we have worked with to provide third-party oversight at shelter locations, everything from small to mass shelter, and they have seen firsthand what works and what doesn't work, and they've done a lot of work in the community to raise their own funding for the capital cost. So I guess I appreciate the level of thought that has been put into this. Calling it a pilot, I think is still appropriate because this is the first time that something like this will be done, will be stood up in our community. And I think there are going to be lessons learned, just like we've learned lessons from every other type of homelessness response that we've had in the municipality. It could be that this is successful, or it could be that it's something that needs to be retooled. But I think particularly what I appreciate is the intent that was stated here today to use these sort of temporary dwelling structures as kind of a safety net for people who are housing insecure or who have just lost their housing, and also the intent to, as quickly as possible, get people into permanent housing. I appreciate the acknowledgement by Restorative Reentry Services that these are not a replacement for housing. And so I think that we can still, as the policymakers, as the Assembly, prioritize permanent housing, which I believe leads to the best health outcomes, but also have this as an adjunct harm reduction, as was stated. Thank you.
So
Just to finish, Chair, if I may,
Sure.
just to close. I recognize the Assembly's role in policymaking, but respectfully to the trusted community providers, my vantage point is that a pilot project that's being proposed would utilize the rubrics that the Assembly has established and would come to us in somewhat of a more complete form, i.e. location, the other community partners. And so I would just encourage that level of pilot detailing. Thank you.
okay, now Mr. Gross.
Yeah, two things. And forgive me, is RRS, are you a for-profit or nonprofit company?
He's not RRS.
Oh, excuse me. Oh,
They're no longer in the room.
they left. Okay, I was just curious. So my question for RRS was just, and is there a mechanism to give them a grant? Because and I don't know how that operates. So
The
just as long
Assembly-
as legal
The
can make
Assembly
sure.
can grant to a for-profit entity.
Okay, fantastic.
We aren't
So-
constrained by those rules. It's just preferable for certain causes and reasons. But the Assembly can make a contract, not a contract, I shouldn't say that. That's the administration side. The Assembly can grant funds. We have.
And the other thing real quick is you guys touched base on it. My concern had to do with that our land use and building code are not conducive to non-traditional forms of construction. So I wanted to make sure some headway could be done on that. And to close that out, just if we're going to focus on trying to fix it with pallet, we should be extending that into factory built, tiny homes, attractive, inexpensive housing options, and not just, hey, how do we fix the pallet issue? Because this is before us. We have an opportunity here to amend code for several forms of more inexpensive yet attractive functional housing options. So if that can be included, if there's anything I can do to help, thank you.
So Alexis,
Yeah, through the chair, is anyone from RRS here?
So Kathleen said on her way that if we had a question for her, I could text it and they'll respond.
Do we have any idea where these 30 units are going?
And the answer is there is no.
Hold on,
centralized-
I am on the,
Monica's, okay.
Hi,
we have-
Monica.
Monica is on the phone from RRS as well.
yeah,
Thanks, Monica.
sorry, I'm on the phone. Alexis, I think we're hesitant to state a place at this time until we decide if the assembly wants to go ahead with the concept.
Through the chair. Thanks, Monica. I guess my biggest concern, and I want to lay it out right now, is that we experienced this same issue with Fairview and the community council not wanting a warming facility. And I would hate to move forward with a project not knowing where 30 pallet shelters are going to go. And then it just pop up in a neighborhood somewhere and say, hey, well, we've already funded it. The assembly and the administration want it. This is our process. So having some sort of public process to let that neighborhood know that we are planning to move forward with a project would be really instrumental, at least from our standpoint.
All right, thank you. Next, Ms. Bronga.
If we can pave the way through this pilot, I would be very excited because as Mr. Campbell said, I've been approached by several faith groups that are willing to do this project in the parking lot. So if we could pave the way that that was possible, and they're not wanting funding, they're wanting to do this. And I feel like we've sort of shut out the opportunity for some of those groups to help in a meaningful way. And this would be a good start to it. But I do agree, we really need to know where this pilot is going. We can't just pop that out there on a neighborhood.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And I would tell you, Fairview is in anybody's sights, it'll be a fight because they have paid their dues to this town and its failure to organize a proper response. Other parts of town need to take it on. Mr. Gates, your correction?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to state that that's correct, that in general, the municipality can contract to give grants to nonprofit organizations. But this resolution specifically cited to Chapter 770, 10A, which that whole chapter is about appropriations to nonprofit service organizations specifically.
So
there was that
it was both. The answer was both to those of you who raised that question. So Mr. Vaughn and then myself. Okay, thank you. So I think there are a number of things I would love to respond to. The argument or the assertion that we have a trusted community partner to do this, I don't disagree with that, but I believe that trusted community partner can't do both, meaning they can't be an assessor of entities that are providing similar services and then provide those similar services. And so I think they'll have to choose. They can't do both because then it would be to their benefit to make arguments about their peer organizations that don't, it would be at least colorable to suggest that, not that they would, but that their opinions would be tainted by a competitive advantage. And so I have concerns about having those two hats on for one organization. I also have a philosophical dilemma. Again, it's the same one that I've spoken to a number of times. And so for my part, what I would like to ask for, and I've spoken to Mr. Rivera about this, is that you allow as members to bifurcate this question on the dais and allow me to vote yes on the one that I can vote yes on and no on the one that I can't vote yes on, so that I don't have to vote no on all of it, because I would like to vote yes. And I don't want to have an hour and a half long conversation over a motion on Tuesday. So for my part, I would ask the members to consider us being allowed to bifurcate and then take up the two questions separately. So I share similar concerns to what Mr. Martinez said. This is too unformulated for me. I can go to a website, I can see a plan for the coalition's project that we're being asked to fund in detail, and I can ask specific questions about how it would function, about what happens when, but it can't do that for this other quote pilot. And it creates for me a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty. And so I'm not ready to vote yes on an encampment and whatever we call it, whatever structures we put in it. But I don't want to put up a fight. And so I'm asking my peers to consider when we come to that part of the question on Tuesday that you allow that to happen. So anyone else wish to get in the queue? Kenny, you want to close us out?
Yeah, thanks. I'm grateful. The solution to do this, and I think if we balance between pilot project and a conceptual, would be probably proof of concept. And so this is part of a proof of concept, and whether or not this body says we really need to try something for the reasons that Kathleen mentioned, that's up to you to decide. If you want to start working on a code change that would allow it for that you're ready to receive it, that's also something to decide. But by passing this, and the sooner, if you're able to decide to present this, I don't think this is seen as a request coming from RRS for money. I think this is RRS stepping up to a need that has been expressed in the community. And so if not RRS, then someone else. And if you like the concept, but you just don't want to spend the money, then approve the concept and say, please go find the money elsewhere, but we want it to happen. And please do it as soon as possible, because if you pass this, it will save lives. And then the second thing that I would say is that based on this effort that was passed as a resolution, I'd probably reiterate the section 2 of this AR 2023-188S1. The question is, what's the location? I don't think anyone's going to take that political football and put it out in front of you. And so I think that the request has to come back from you to your community councils that says, we think this is a great idea. What locations can we recommend? And you bring it in rather than us presenting it.
Mr. Folland.
So I don't think that's going to happen. I love your optimism. But I just am more and more persuaded that is not how community councils function. There's many wonderful things about community councils. Welcoming homeless neighbors into their boundaries is typically not one of them. But I will say the where is very important. And I think if you want maximum support, we're going to need to know that. Thanks.
I don't disagree with anything you just said there. I think that there is a partner that owns land somewhere that has to be at the table before this is realistic enough to me to support appropriating $500,000, but that's up to the body. So anyone else? Last chance. Hearing and seeing none. It is it's 2:07 on Friday. You should all get out of here and go enjoy your snowy weekend. Yeah. We're adjourned.